intervals or any type of exercise intensity is prescribed with a feel. It's prescribed by feel, and it can be a zone feel, but that should be part of the educational process of the coach athlete. Is to know what zone 2 feels like, know what zone 3 feels like, know what zone 5 feels like.
That Triathlon Show 128. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and on today's episode I interview Professor Paul Laursen on the topic of interval training. This is a long interview because it ended up being really interesting and good, I think. So I split it into, you'll hear part 1 today and part 2 on Thursday. To give you a bit of a background about Paul, he is adjunct professor and performance physiologist at Auckland University of Technology, and he led the performance physiology team at High Performance Sport New Zealand for both the London and Rio Olympic cycles. He is also a coach himself. He coaches elite triathletes like Kyle Buckingham, for example. And he is currently writing a book with Martin Boucher titled The Science and Application of High-Intensity Interval Training, which is the topic of today's interview as well. But before that, let's thank Precision Hydration for supporting this podcast. At the time of this recording, I'm just wrapping up planning some epic bike rides for a training camp that I'm organizing in the Algarve in southern Portugal in just a little bit more than a week now that I record this, I should say. And you'll bet that those long bike rides will see me filling my bottles with Precision Hydration to keep me hydrated and keep my electrolyte stores tapped up so that I don't suffer from cramps, which would be easy to do in that heat, or even just performance decrements if you let your electrolyte stores run low. So I'll use my typical pH 1000, which I mostly use for training, sometimes in really hot conditions, even pH 1500, so that depends a bit. But listeners of That Triathlon Show can, as you know, get their first box of Precision Hydration for free when you go to precisionhydration.com and use the promo code That Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps. And remember to first take their free online sweat test to find out what strength of electrolyte product you should get to fit your individual sweat sodium content. All right, let's hear part 1 of my interview with Professor Paul Laursen. Today's guest on That Triathlon Show is Paul Laursen. Welcome, Paul. How are you today?
Oh, doing great. Thanks, Michael.
It's great to have you. I've been really excited for this interview. It's a fascinating topic, interval training, and you are one of the key co-authors of a new book on that topic coming out later. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but can you first give us just a brief summary of why we should be doing interval training in general, and what your work in interval training is about other than writing a book?
Yeah, well, I guess maybe just to start with your first question, why interval training is of benefit, and it's really a bit of a buzz term these days. It's really taken off. Even if you go to kind of Google Trends and stuff, you can see the increase in interest over probably the last 5 years, particularly, but even over the last 10 years. But the last 5 years has just been going crazy. And people are just really, I guess, realizing the certain benefit of this. It has a lot of benefits to just. I'm just speaking really globally in terms of the benefit for any human, and that's just. I think that probably the key ones, the key areas, would be your recruitment of your fast twitch motor units that. In today's modern world, most of us are not getting the recruitment of those larger, bigger, fast twitch motor units. And, high intensity interval training, which we should kind of, we should define it. This is when you're exercising above your so-called anaerobic threshold. So you're, it's that exercise intensity where you're breathing quite hard, or there's there's a solid effort that's going into the workload. And I guess so the first thing that's happening there is that your brain is recruiting these fast twitch motor units that typically don't get activated when you're sitting at a desk like you and I are right now, speaking to one another. And that's the first one. And then there's, the VO2 max benefits, typically, if we're going to be talking about, exercise that's targeting, maximal cardiac output, high heart rates. That's also another stimulus that a lot of us aren't getting. Those of us in the triathlon community are probably not typically getting that as much as other forms of, prolonged aerobic fat burning type exercise. And then finally is the I guess third or fourth potential benefits might be your glycolytic system, your that lactate kind of burning one, and the neuromuscular system as well. And then there's a variety of other things that are going on and things we don't even know about as well. But there's some general overall health benefits, and that's I think probably the answer to the first question is just the realization of those benefits. And that's the public's got a hold of that. So there's a genuine interest in that. And then, we can talk about triathlon and why a triathlete could really benefit from maybe more of that type of work than. Yeah,
let's give a brief summary of the performance benefits on that side, from that perspective, for triathletes specifically of intervals, like not going very deep, but just a summary.
Yeah, well, to be honest, it's not too far off those ones that I've just mentioned for anyone. Again, if you consider that, the majority of most programs in triathlon tends to be that are obeying the principle of specificity. It tend to be a lot of base work and aerobic training and coffee ride, chit chat kind of training. And that's, that is the majority, I think, of the training. And it probably should be that in most triathletes. But where interval training really can come in is different ways of getting at those high muscle recruitments, high cardiac output, high VO2 max, or high VO2, and just getting that the dose of those sorts of things right. The higher we can, I guess, what interval training allows, I guess, is through a training effect, is you getting used to recruiting those larger and larger motor units. And when you do that on a routine kind of basis, you're giving the signals of those larger motor units or fast twitch fibers to become a little bit more fatigue resistant, for example. You're giving those guys the signal to develop more mitochondria. Now, mitochondria are they're the powerhouses of the cells that facilitate aerobic respiration. They give us ATP aerobically, no byproducts, just carbon dioxide and water. And as a result, that's when you're looking at an elite athlete performing on the world stage, pick your hero. But those individuals have got that system in their in relatively larger motor units dialed in and operating extremely efficiently. So interval training is one of the methods that a triathlete can use to help get farther down the line in performance. That's what so many of us kind of want. So it's why it's important for coaches and athletes to definitely consider it.
Great. And what about your background? You're in or have been in performance physiology for a long time, obviously, and I've talked a little bit about your background in the intro. But how did you get interested specifically in interval training, and so interested that you're now writing a book with Martin Buchheit? I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but that's going to be out later this year. How did that come about?
Yeah, well, that's a long story. That's a great story and a good place to start. So my background, I guess, comes as a like so many of us in the sports science, I come from a bit of a frustrated athlete's perspective. I got into exercise and sport at a young age and into triathlon in my teens. Uh, Tried to become, I guess, a professional through my 20s, failed at that, and as a result went to try to learn more about it. So it kind of took that same sort of drive as I got into the sports sciences, and I guess I decided that I wanted to have a career in that. So one of the questions that I had was along the lines of interval training, or in other words, was there some form of training that I could do? And you have to remember as well, this is back in like the 90s and the early 2000s. So, is there a form of exercise that kind of gives you the best bang for buck? And that was the question that I had. So I did my doctoral studies on that on a scholarship in Australia, and I guess spent a solid 3-4 years doing that, and then continued down that line. And I guess some of the when I was in Australia and did some work with the Australian Institute of Sport and some of their workers. And at that same time, through those publications, on the other side of the world, Martin Bichette, you weren't too close, you weren't too far off on the name, but yeah, Martin Bichette was kind of having similar questions from a team sport perspective, and we really started with the I guess true science, where we're really looking at how the body is responding to different forms of intensities and different formulas of intensities and durations. We formed a lot of experiments to get at that question collaboratively through our various works, and published lots on that. And
Well, we
finally,
had
I
a bit of a
guess,
connection issue here the last 15 seconds or so. So can you repeat that the last couple of sentences?
yeah. So I guess so collaboratively, Martin and I worked together on a lot of these different interval areas, and we coin a phrase actually in our book. There's more than one way to skin a cat. So I guess we really were investigating the different ways you can skin a cat when it comes to training. That's an old English proverb or saying that there's more than one way to get at an outcome. And we spent a lot of time together researching and publishing on the different ways you can skin a cat when it comes to interval training. And I guess at the popularity of interval training grew, and as a result, the people that are higher up in the journals contacted Martin and I and asked us to form a review of the literature and lead a review of the literature. And it's the journal's called Sports Medicine. It's in the sports sciences. It's the leading review journal. And so we put our head together over, I guess 2-3 years. It took us a long time to write it. It's a bit of a beast of a paper, or it's a 2-part paper. And yeah, we published that, and then after we published the paper, that got a lot of interest. Then the publishers at Human Kinetics came to us and and asked us to write a book on it, and we said no, and we kept saying no, and they kept coming back, and finally the timing was kind of right with myself. I was working at by that time I was working with the New Zealand Olympic program, leading their physiology team, and I said, okay, well, that's probably end of the Olympic cycle in Rio is probably a good time to head back home to Canada with the family, and whilst I'm there, I'll write the book with Martin while Martin continues to work for Paris Saint-Germain Football Club as the lead of performance there. So we've got I think our advantage, I guess, on this whole book is that we've got a very solid understanding of both the academic or research side, alongside of the the way you can actually apply it to athletes. And we put those things together, and it's not just Martin and I as well. So Martin, it's the book is titled "The Science and Application of High Intensity Interval Training," and the application chapters are actually written by practitioners that are embedded in 20 of the world's most popular sports that actually apply interval training. So, because there is that disconnect sometimes that we see in the academic realm, the studies that are actually done in the labs versus what actually gets done in the field. And we're really trying to bring the two worlds together ultimately. And that's the purpose of the book. And we hope that people will enjoy it and most importantly, find it of use in optimizing their own performances.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. And let's dive a bit deeper and get the information that you have already researched out of you here so that the listeners can already start applying some of that knowledge. And maybe we should start with defining what different kinds of intervals you can do or what kind of interval training you can do, because not all interval training, as you said, is created equal. There are different ways to skin a cat. So what are the broad categories of interval training that you can do as a triathlete or in any sport, really?
Yeah, super question. A great place to start. And we do cover that in depth in the book. But let me go through a little bit of a breakdown. This is probably the big twist that we do in the book, at least we try to do in the book. I guess time will tell whether we're successful at it or not. But we're, again, based on how we think about performance. We think about the human first and how the human's going to respond. So we actually ask people in the book to think more about the target that they're trying to go after in terms of the physiological adaptations that they're trying to make. And basically we've broken those down into 6 different targets, or actually even starting back, three basic systems that we're trying to target in terms of physiological systems. So, and those are the ones that I mentioned in the beginning. So, are we trying to enhance the ability of a system to produce energy aerobically? So, are we trying to enhance the aerobic oxidative system? Number 1. Number 2, are we trying to enhance the ability of the glycolytic system, the anaerobic system, to improve its output? Number 2. And then number 3 would be are we looking for various neuromuscular, mechanical, or musculoskeletal type adaptations, right? So recruitment principles, or trying to lessen the impact of muscle damage. So that would be the third one, with those 3 broad categories. And if you take those 3 broad categories, you can actually create 6 sort of intervals, kind of, or types of adaptations or targets come out. So you can have different forms of interval training that really just target your oxidative system if you if you skin the cat the right way. You can have a second type 2, that they also elicit an oxidative aerobic response, but are also neuromuscularly demanding. The third type of response would be an oxidative system again. However, you would also be targeting the anaerobic glycolytic system. That would be your type 3. Type 4 one, that's one when you're hitting all 4 physiological areas in your target. So an oxidative, anaerobic, neuromuscular type. The 5th would be one where you're actually turning off the oxidative system. You're giving enough rest and you're manipulating or skinning the cat enough so that you target the anaerobic and neuromuscular systems only.
So and then the final I missed the last sentence here again with the connection issues. Can you finish that or take that sentence from the beginning with the number 5? I think that's when I lost you.
Number 5. Yes, the type 5 would be the anaerobic neuromuscular system, when you're removing the oxidative component of it because you're giving enough rest and recovery between the intervals when you're skinning the cat. And then the final one is the type 6, is a neuromuscular only type response, which actually technically isn't high intensity interval training. This is more speed or strength type work. but it's important in our model that we have that in there to appreciate the influence many of us will know that the neuromuscular musculoskeletal type stress has on us. So 6 types of targets. Now, we haven't even gone into the different forms of interval trainings, but let's just we ask the reader to just consider those various targets that they have.
Can I just cut in here briefly to say something, because we could obviously talk for hours and hours about what the aerobic, anaerobic, or glycolytic and neuromuscular systems are and go into great depth on that. But then we would have no time for interval training. So I just want to tell the listeners that at least for the aerobic and anaerobic side of things, there is an episode that I did in episode 71, I believe. I'll get it right in the show notes, that they can go and listen to learn about how they differ and kind of get the background if they are uncertain about what we're talking about.
Yeah, so the type 5 type of interval training, this is more of one where you would you skin the cat appropriately with enough pauses on your during your recovery that you facilitate basically an anaerobic and a neuromuscular stimulus only, and you turn off the oxidative system. And these are ones that are associated with very high muscular recruitment levels. And then type 6 would be one where it would be neuromuscular only, with just a neuromuscular stimulus. So these are more for speed and strength type workouts, very short, so no oxidative or anaerobic type engagements to speak of, and it's actually not technically considered high intensity interval training, but it's important that we include it within our model because of the importance of the neuromuscular musculoskeletal strain or stress that we that really can complicate a coach's programming puzzle. So yeah, those are the 6 types of targets that we put forth in our model, and we haven't even got into the different types of formats of interval training first, but we just start there with the physiological target responses that we're after when we're considering a programming situation for our athletes.
Yeah, so to wrap up what we have so far, we have 3 systems: the aerobic, anaerobic, and neuromuscular, and the targets are combinations of them, or they can be also just a single one of those systems that we target with a certain type of interval training, and how we program the workouts then makes us achieve those targets. And just a quick note for the listeners, if you're not quite sure about the difference between aerobic and anaerobic, in particular, I don't have an episode on neuromuscular training particularly, but for aerobic and anaerobic training, episode 71, I believe. I'll get it in the show notes so that you can get the right link. But that's where we cover the difference between aerobic and anaerobic energy production and those systems, and how it works in terms of training and what you see in your heart rate, etc., etc. So that's something that you can look at to understand as we go deeper into the format of the workouts. But before we talk about the format, are some of these targets particularly useful for triathletes, or more useful for and beneficial for triathletes than other targets?
Yeah, I think they all have their place, but there's maybe next we will. Well, yeah, I mean the oxidative target is probably the most important one. I would say maybe the neuromuscular one actually might be next. The neuromuscular musculoskeletal one, especially when you're considering the importance of that on the run. Right? You really need to get your neuromuscular stimulus right to withstand the heavy muscle damage that always happens during the run phase of a triathlon, which tends to be the most important phase, really, when we're looking, at least especially in the pointy end of competitions in triathlon. And then maybe the anaerobic system would be the last one of importance, but could still be at times useful. I'm thinking especially in like Olympic distance, drafting races, draft legal races, where there's lots of there's various different tactics And it might even be really important in the swim start as well, for positioning and those sorts of things. So yeah, in that order, oxidative, neuromuscular, anaerobic targets for me would be my priority for the triathlon context specific athlete.
So let's talk about how to structure and plan workouts to achieve these targets and to target the different systems. What are the variables that we can play around with, and how should we think about playing around with them and structuring the workouts?
Yeah, great question. So we break it down into 12 various factors we can use to skin the cat. And just to give you a level of the complexity that we're dealing with here, if there's any mathematical gurus that are sort of out there, you can run something called a factor analysis. And if you throw 12 different variables in there, it comes out to there's over 1 million different ways you can skin the cat when it comes to training. And which is probably why we see so many different, ways of training that can lead to success. That's the good news, I guess. But can we also get a little bit more specific? And that was kind of our goal of the book. So I won't go into all 12 factors; it'll be too much. But I'll give you the big rocks, the most important ones. And the first one is probably the intensity of the exercise at any bout. That's factor number one. So what degree of intensity are we talking about? Now, again, go back to the definition of interval training. We're not talking about anything that's under your FTP or your anaerobic threshold or whatever you want to call that. So we're talking about intensities above that, but even with intensities above your FTP, there's a lot of different, there's a long way to go, right? From all out max power, which in a top triathlete, that might be 1,000 watts, for example, and even higher in a cyclist, or extremely fast running speeds as well, up to maybe 25 kilometers an hour at a very fast, extremely fast runner. So that's the intensity sort of range that we can kind of go through, and there's many different intervals that you can. There's a long way to go in terms of the intensity selection that you could make in your interval. Of course, the other one that parallels or pairs with it is the duration. Of course, the higher the intensity that you go, the shorter the duration that you're only going to be able to withstand that interval. And so that needs to always be factored in. And again, when you start, those are the two most important factors: the intensity and the duration of that intensity for your exercise bout. And the higher the intensity, coupled with that longer duration at that high intensity, as the listener will know, the more you're digging into that, the more this is going to have an effect on your physiology or your stress or strain. So that, but I guess that can be tempered or controlled a little bit if you have appropriate bouts of recovery between those high exercise intensities and durations of those intensities. And then the other thing that we can kind of have in there, I guess, in that recovery bout between the interval bouts is different. We can have those as passive, or we can have those as active. So, those are probably the main ones: is the number of bouts, their intensity, their duration, and then the intensity and the duration of the recovery bouts between those. And if we wanted to add kind of another one later on down the road, it would be the intensity and the duration of the recovery between the series. You might have a number of different series of these intervals that you're prescribing. So with those as the main variables that we can manipulate, it might be a good idea to sort of talk about the categorization of some of the main interval formats that a coach or athlete might use. I'm not sure, Michael, where you want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead with that. That sounds great.
Cool. So we take those. again, we've got our 6 target types, and now we're moving into that we said before with the physiological targets. The next phase that we kind of go to is really understanding the main categorization of interval formats that we can use to kind of place into our programs to hit those targets. And the main, I'll start with the very first one. I would call those long intervals. And again, remember that the intensity that we're referring to is above your threshold. And the main one that comes to mind in long intervals. Now, when we say long intervals, these are interval bouts above that threshold, and longer than 2 minutes. Okay, so the duration of that bout above threshold is longer than 2 minutes. Probably no longer than about 5 or 6 minutes. That's kind of getting to the upper end of the duration of a long interval. So not that long, really, but in the context of interval training, especially where intervals can be quite short and sharp, the long interval is that 2 to 5 or 6 minute duration, and typically you can't really withstand that too much above your so-called VO2 max pace. Probably have heard of these might be called VO2 max intervals to some. That's what we're also sort of referring to. And I guess these are typically giving us a type 3 or a type 4 target, right? So recall that a type 3 target is your oxidative anaerobic, and then your type 4 target is oxidative, anaerobic, and neuromuscular. All right, and you can imagine.
So would you, with 2 minute intervals, would you get some neuromuscular benefits as well, or how do they break down? Where do not necessarily saying that there is a specific threshold, but is it with the shorter intervals that they're so sharp and sweet that you actually get that much neuromuscular recruitment that's also another benefit of them and another targeted system?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good. That's again, it depends. But if you were if the intensity wasn't crazy, then that would be a nice one. Where almost giving you you could get a really nice type 3 response on that, not too neuromuscular type sort of wise on that, which could be really useful in the program for a 2 minute one. But if the intensity was high for over 2 minutes, you could certainly get a neuromuscular one as well. So it would flip between the type 3 or the type 4. Again, it really kind of depends. It depends on the individual we're talking about, and that's the main thing. So, and I really almost should have started with that. We always have to start with the context of the athlete type, right? So if I'm, this is the prescription that I'm going to be giving for one of the elites that I coach is going to be far, far different than someone that's just starting into their first triathlon. So my context here is I typically train very, very elite guys. And so, that's for them. That's kind of the ones I'm talking here. But a 2 minute interval could be.
Let's actually both make a mental note here that after we cover these formats and go through them, that we'll talk about a couple of scenarios for different types of athletes, what kind of workouts they might be doing. But keep going. So we had the long intervals, and was there anything else about them, or do you want to go on to the next?
No, I think that's about it. So say 2 to 5 minutes on the duration, VO2 max intensity about is kind of the ballpark on the long intervals. And the next one we kind of move into is the short interval. These are, I see them at least less used in triathlon training, but I will say highly effective and quite versatile of a format. So the duration range of the short interval can be as short as 10 seconds and as long as 60 seconds. That's kind of the duration that we're playing with. We can hit just about every single target type 1 through 4. All right, so it can be oxidative only, which is really useful, especially because we don't want that anaerobic or neuromuscular stimulus sometimes in a program. We just really want to keep the aerobic engine ticking along. So highly useful and versatile format.
And is that because of the recovery it takes,
Yeah.
or the additional injury risk and risk of illness, etc., that you would want to keep it to just aerobic, and that's still like the big thing that we want to develop as triathletes because it's an aerobic sport?
Exactly. You got it. So if you can tick that aerobic engine along, but not, I guess, elicit a sympathetic nervous system response that you get with both the neuromuscular and the glycolytic type activations, then you keep fatigue at bay ultimately, and it's a nice little tricky way to keep the system happy. You keep your immune system functioning quite well in that, and it's not overly stressful, but you're still gaining that larger motor unit recruitment, which you wanna maximize. And you also touched on another thing, Michael, where it is indeed the recovery time, right? So imagine if you're only going, let's say 10 seconds on an extreme case, but then you're pausing for another 10 seconds. Well, in that pause, where imagine it being passive, where you're not doing anything for another 10 seconds, you get a complete restoration of this cool compound that's in our muscle called myoglobin. All right, so it's kind of the muscle's hemoglobin, and it winds up resaturating really quickly. And as a result, it's available. That oxygen is available there for aerobic respiration in the next bout, and also as a result, it doesn't elicit the lactate or the lactate system ultimately. So you can actually, if you manipulate your intervals down to 10 seconds, like imagine doing a series of 10 on, 10 off, and just a bunch of those repetitively, you can actually exercise at VO2 max. So you're breathing heavy, heart rate's near max, but you can maintain like a super manageable blood lactate level of like around 4 millimoles. And that in itself actually was one of the things that just fascinated us when we first got into the area of interval training. So yeah, short intervals, I see them as being I guess less utilized in the triathlon community, but they could be highly effective at gaining both the aerobic stimulus and the recruitment without overly being stressful.
Got it. Okay. So next, after short intervals, what's the next format?
Well, now we're kind of moving away from things that aren't too used in triathletes, but I'll just briefly touch on them. So the next one would be repeated sprint training, and so repeated sprint training would be, this is more used in the team sport context. They're all out activities. There's sprints over 3 to 7 seconds, and then they're maybe a 20-second pause kind of thing, and then they do it again. If you watch any team sport athletes, rugby players, soccer players, etc., they're doing a lot of repeat sprints because they really need to engage the type 3 and type 5 targets, really, or sorry, type 4 and type 5 targets for that repeated sprint training. And and their the speed and the ability to repeat speed is important. And then the other, but yeah, not used too much. I've seen it in a couple scenarios, maybe in athletes that are lacking top speed. They might utilize that in the run or even in the swim as well. That might be a type of swim workout. You can engage that, but not too often in most triathletes programs. And then the final one, which again probably even be less used in a triathletes program, and these would be sprint interval training. This is when you're prolonging that all-out maximal exercise. So this would be 30 to 40 seconds of all-out max, and then a very long recovery. To fully recover that anaerobic glycolytics, the anaerobic and neuromuscular systems. So you can fully engage it again. So it's not, the oxidative system isn't engaged too much in this situation. They're solely type 5 targets.
It's like a mid distance runner workout.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like an 800-meter runner type workout for sure, or a sprinter workout, and or it's they're not too pleasant. If there's any exercise physiologists out there, they'd know this as a Wingate test. It's ultimately repeating a Wingate test, if you know that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so now then let's talk about a bit about the different types of athletes and how to think about it. So maybe if we start with like your mid-packer who does 70.3s and Ironmans, like how do they? We already said that the aerobic system is what we want to focus on the most, but how should somebody like that particular athlete type choose what kind of format and how to structure their interval workouts? Is there anything specific that is different for them compared to your elite guys on the ITU circuit, for example?
Yeah, well, I guess you could start with, with any sport or with any athlete's program, we do want to think about the principle of specificity. And in general, with a 70.3 or Olympic distance type athlete that's really getting out there to compete as best they can, but they've got a full-time job and they're working and they can only spend 10 hours a week generally of training, then you would want a certain amount of that training to be aerobic. But again, with limited time, you could get a little bit more bang for buck with a low volume training program to incorporate some of a few more interval training type activities in your training. And there's loads of options out there. When you look at some of the wind trainer type programs that are out there, whether it's Trainer Road or Zwift or whatever you want to consider. There's lots of different ways, but one of the things you might want to have in there is, again, looking at the different target types. You might want to have some of these type 1 short intervals that are in there, right? Where it's 10 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and when I'm talking about the intensity on the short intervals, that might be more in your, just above the your VO2 max intensity, but only for 10 seconds and then off for 10 seconds and kind of continue that. And that could go up to 20 seconds. That could be progressed to 30 seconds and on it kind of goes. So short intervals would be a great little one to kind of have targeted in there. And then, again, it really depends on the athlete, but a different format might be that longer interval in there where we're doing 2 or 3 3-minute VO2 max type intervals with a 2 to 3 minute recovery duration in there as well to fully recover. And you're at VO2 max when you're breathing very, very hard and heavy, and your heart rate is near its max by the end of this. And of course, the number of these bouts that you tag on there is going to be really important as well. And I guess the less fit you are, the lower number of these you'll be able to achieve without gaining too much stress in the body. So yeah, that's and we can talk about that later about how to kind of manage that stress for the different individuals. But for a typical 10-hour a week Olympic distance 70.3 type person, those would be good to kind of have in there maybe 2 or 3 times a week alongside your aerobic type activities, maybe a longer ride or a longer run on the weekend sort of thing.
So would that be like one interval training on the swim and on the bike and on the run, and then the rest would be aerobic, or how would you break those 2 or 3 interval sessions down? Was it within each discipline, or can you clarify that?
Yeah, and again, it's so individual context, right?
Yeah.
So the fitter that we are, the more we can we can handle this. We could have 2 a week in a given discipline in an athlete that could handle that, but one in each discipline would probably be more than enough for an individual that's just kind of starting out. And the different even the modes of exercise in a triathlete are going to have different physiological impacts too, right? So with running is going to be the most stressful. Cycling would probably be next, and then swimming would likely be last. But again, probably also depends on the background of the individual. Where if someone's coming in from without any swimming background as well, a swimming workout might be highly stressful on them too. So it's unfortunately there's so much of this kind of stuff that it comes back to it depends. And again, this is really the importance of for those triathletes that are out there is listening. It's the importance of getting a good coach it can be worth its weight in gold.
So I want to get into like how a given athlete can kind of measure the effectiveness or what they should try to target, not necessarily the format of the workout, but what should be the end goal to get the most bang for buck for each workout. But first, you mentioned there that athletes that can handle it can do quite a bit more interval training. And I recently interviewed David Warden about the topic of 80-20 training distribution. So 80% of the training being easy endurance training below the aerobic threshold, and only 20% being above that. So potentially at most 20% of your training volume would be this type of interval training, or even anything above the aerobic threshold. So where do you fall on that spectrum? Do you agree with that? Or do you think that for age groupers that have limited time to train, that this rule is something that can be bent? And if so, to what extent?
Yeah, it's a super question. I was actually going to bring it up too, so I'm really glad you brought it up on the polarization thing. And it's when we see this is so Dan Plews and I, my colleague. One of the things that we've generally seen, because we've worked with athletes that are up training up to 35 hours a week, and then of course we coach individuals that are weekend warriors, and they'll only be able to train 8 to 10 hours a week. And what we find is that the polarization is really important for athletes that are high, in the high volume phase, really around when they start going above 20 hours a week is where things really start to matter in terms of that polarization. So if you're an athlete and you're going over 20 in terms of your weekly hourly training, then you wouldn't probably want to have 30% of that time as high intensity work, I guess above your what's actually called your first ventilatory threshold, your aerobic threshold. So you don't want to have the majority of that training overall above, which might be like a zone 3 and above. You wouldn't want to be up there. At least what we see, we see athletes tending to trend towards kind of the overtraining, just too much stress in the system for most individuals. Some people can handle it for a while, but probably not sort of too long. So to answer your question, in general, that 80-20 polarization theory works great for the athletes that are kind of in that 20 plus, and for the bulk of those could be interval work. It's great when that 20% is the majority of that 20% is high intensity intervals. Although for a lot of triathletes, especially the Ironman guys, it might be more in that sort of tempo zone. It's because they need to do we believe they need to do sort of prolonged efforts that are specific to the intensity they'll be riding and running at in an Ironman.
This is really, really interesting because do you want to take a guess at what David picked as his threshold for when polarization becomes important, where you picked 20? And I'm not saying that any of you is right or wrong, but I just think it's brilliant to get different perspectives. So what do you think David said for the weekly, hourly threshold?
Oh, I have no idea. I mean, I don't know, David. I'm sorry.
I'll tell you. It was 7 hours. So when you go about 7 hours per week, he wanted you to adhere to the 80-20 principle. And I don't program according to 80-20, but I calculate after I program like what the distribution is. And I think I fall probably somewhere in between in that for running, even for lower volume, like 7-8 hours, I definitely tend to stick to having 20% or less at a high intensity. But for cycling, I definitely do quite a bit more, especially for those athletes that are around 10 hours or 12 hours. And then only when you approach 15, 20 hours, as you say, that's when I try to keep it down to that 20%. But definitely for a 10-hour athlete, or then it could easily be that that 30% or 35% is more high intensity, or not high intensity, but race specific. So that's zone 3, which would be the moderate intensity, I guess, in this context. This was a bit of a side track from the interval training, but it's very interesting to discuss that as well, and put some things in perspective and get different perspectives. So good.
I think Michael, I think it's incredibly important topic, and I think it really just highlights how individual we all are. Because I mean, I've been fortunate to train. I train an elite professional. One of the he would be he's won multiple Ironmans in the world, and this guy would be down training around 15 hours a week. And he's an elite, less than 15 hours a week, but he would be incredibly, just high intensity interval training all over the map. So it'd be way over. He almost be kind of 50%, but that's an extreme outlier.
Is this the case study we'll talk about later towards the end of the episode?
No. This is a different one. This is different. So the case we'll talk about later would be well and truly polarized, more in the 20 to 25 hour a week, but well and truly kind of more the 80-20. And then the final example I was going to give you would be a hardworking banking business guy in Singapore. He's only got 7 to 10 hours a week training, but again, he would be this is a top age grouper in the world. He'd be in the top 5 in his age group in Kona, and he would be high intensity all over the board. So during his no time to train, but when he's training, he's almost 7 to 10 hours, but it's all high intensity. It's really, really extreme, kind of, probably be 70%. So it's just, it is, we are also, there's not a whole lot of rules that are necessarily out there that are absolute. We are also individual.
Yeah, those are brilliant examples to show the disparity between different athletes and what works for different types of athletes. Mm-hmm. Let's get back to a bit how we can kind of think about structuring our interval workouts for example, for a self-coached athlete, or for coaches listening to this. Are there any key performance indicators, as is trendy in the business world to talk about, for how you structure a workout? Like, for example, I'm thinking things like time in zone, or rate of lactate accumulation, or anything else that we should think about. Even in strength training, resistance training, would be total tonnage. So that could be something in maybe a neuromuscular type of workout that you want to keep track of. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, it's a super good question. Come across this one a lot when I'm consulting with various coaches and stuff. And one of the things from those discussions we often talk about is, time in zone might be a good place to start. And that really gives insight into, some of the polarization stuff we've just spoken on. But because you kind of want to, you want to know the heart rate and its association with the speed and power. And I find it interesting, amusing, that a lot of coaches, they tend to throw out one or the other. And I think one of the most important things you can do as a coach or self-coached athlete is really make sure that you have both your heart rate and speed power. It's just so easy to collect and throw on a heart rate monitor at the same time, really. That's making sure you've got those kind of to begin with. And then if you're using like a system like Training Peaks or Garmin Connect, you should be able to get the metrics to see your various time in zone. So that would be a really good place to start. But I think maybe the other important thing is, from a prescription standpoint, that I think is important, is that intervals or any type of exercise intensity is prescribed with a feel. It's prescribed by feel, and it can be a zone feel, but that should be part of the educational process of the coach athlete. Is to know what zone 2 feels like, know what zone 3 feels like, know what zone 5 feels like, and you should be if you get a prescription of an intensity for a certain duration, you should know the ballpark of what that feels like. And you might not know it from day one, but again, through the trial and error process, you should be working towards knowing what that feels like. And then once you get that knowledge and awareness of where those zones are and how they feel, we should then be monitoring the associated power, speed, and heart rate of those. And if you do that, it's enabling, I guess, in my mind, it's enabling the body to adapt optimally. Because if you are prescribing, absolute intensities, whether they be power or speed, and you kind of don't know what the brain feels like doing. It's good to give a guideline. That's what I usually do. So it should be in this zone. But if you're letting the athlete kind of go and do that workout at the zone prescription, you'll and to do their best job at that zone, then the brain will allow them to do a better workout and get a better adaptation signal if they're so inclined and if they're feeling good. And additionally, they're not overly stressed if for some reason they're unable to appropriately achieve that objective on that day. So yeah, I think that's my general belief and advice, and the things that I do with my athletes when I'm coaching them on hitting these certain targets on certain days.
I really hope that you enjoyed that first part of the interview, and definitely tune in on Thursday again to hear part 2 in episode 129. In the meantime, you can check out Paul on Twitter, where he's at Paul B. Laursen, or you can go to plusandprof.com, which is his website, together with a previous guest of the podcast, Dan Plus. They work together on that site. They're coaching through it and have all sorts of great content related to triathlon and endurance sports in general. So check that out as well. And also, as usual, check out the show notes for this episode on thattriathlonshow.com. If you have suggestions for podcast topics or guests that you want to hear on the podcast, contact me on michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K, or tweet me on Twitter, where my handle is @SciTriat. Also, a bit of a plug here for an ultimate guide that I updated recently on strength training. So it's a big blog post that goes into everything, the science and application of strength training for triathletes. I'll link to it in the episode description below, or you can just Google scientific triathlon strength training and it's the first result that you will see. Finally, if I can ask for a favor, please keep spreading the word about the podcast as much as you possibly can. That really helps the show grow. And Paul said in our pre-interview chat that he hadn't heard of it before. So it further adds to the evidence that I really need to step up my game in making the podcast a household name in the triathlon podcasting industry. And I cannot do it without you and your help. So every person that you get to listen to that triathlon show is really appreciated, both you and them, of course. Finally, thank you so much to Precision Hydration for helping me bring this show to you every week. You can find them on precisionhydration.com, where you can take their free online sweat test to find out what your individual electrolyte and sodium needs are, because it is very different from person to person. One person may be just fine with 500 milligrams of sodium per hour, whereas another person may need 1500 milligrams. So that's a big difference. and there are even more extreme cases in some cases. But that already goes to show you that you cannot just rely on whatever is in your generic sports drink if you want to get the electrolytes that you lose in your sweat replenished. And that is something that you absolutely need to do, especially for long distance races and when you're racing in hot conditions. Again, that's precisionhydration.com, and you use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, to get your first box for free. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.